All right, everybody. I'm not quite sure what happened to Dinah. Are you there, Dinah?
I am here.
All right, you're live.
I've got actually 2 ringing things happening on Skype, but if you can't hear it, I'll put up with it. So here I am, Dinah Snyder, hosting the Canary Chronicles again this week. You sure you guys can't hear that other ringtone in the background?
I hear it coming through your microphone. You just need to hang up on whatever other call's coming in.
Yeah, there isn't any others. Isn't that the craziest thing? There aren't any. Let me see. I'll figure this out. Because, yeah, that's pretty annoying. See, I'm not showing anything else coming in. Is that better? Is it gone now? It's gone for me.
It's gone.
Okay. The last 2 sessions that I've had, or perhaps it was only one, things have been really crazy just lately. I've really focused on politics, and I have a chronic aversion to politics. And my focus has really been health and health care and people and people's issues, our issues. I really wanted to leave the politics for my show over on Wide Awake News, which, of course, you can catch on Monday afternoons at 2 o'clock California time. But this whole thing with Syria and the Middle East and some things that are going on in our own country here, I've really felt compelled to overstate the obvious over at Wide Awake News and here pertaining to the bigger issues. The meaning and the relationship of the US dollars, the reserve currency, and the implications that are looming regarding the Iranian borscht, Russia, Japan, and China's interactions with this attempt to move away from the US dollar as the reserve currency, as the petrodollar. And through my dealings with people, of course, I've come to realize that people don't really understand money, and they don't understand economics, and they don't understand banking. And after some years spent focusing on economics, I can tell you that since they can't dazzle you with their brilliance, they're merely blinding you with their bullshit. Too many credible resources are putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with answers that are identical to what I'm about to explain to you, for it to be coincidental. And when you add to that the really draconian measures to shut down citizen journalists by passing measures that narrowly define the legal description of a journalist and want to label truthers and alternative media people like us as political dissidents or terrorists in the spirit of, with us or against us, it begs some important questions. Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas had said, "Restriction of free thought and free speech is the most dangerous of all subversions. It is the one un-American act that could easily defeat us." And Benjamin Franklin said, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech." And never have words rung more true than at this time. FEMA has quietly gotten posse comitatus loosened to facilitate foreign troops on U.S. soil, and those numbers have quietly increased. Primarily Russian troops, who now know exactly how to operate U.S. tactical equipment in U.S. suburbs. They've been trained to speak English, and they are still here. While the troops have arrived, none have left. This begs for questions and answers that no one is asking, and there is silence, no one's answering. Urban strategic warfare chat rooms have gone quiet. Leave dates have been blocked out for dates which coincide with specific training areas out of local areas. Does knowing this make me a terrorist or a reporter? Laws proposed and recommended without dissent that will force doctors to attach mental and social information to Obamacare central data networks. 1984 is alive and well. The laws being locked in to hold a post-martial law population well in check. DHS drills and constitutional kill switches. For those who don't remember, before 9/11, there were rumbles of terrorists threatened to do X, Y, and Z on U.S. soil. Now, supposedly, there are rumblings, again, of terrorists threatening to do A, B, and C on U.S. soil. Since we know the provenance of 9/11 and just who it was and how it was orchestrated, and given what we've seen of the DHS ammo buys, equipment buys, meals ready to eat buys, FEMA drills going hot, gun grabs, amendment infringements, NDAA, on and on and on, the DHS-sponsored police urban warfare drills, and some rather alarming insider info, it would be safe to say that we are about to be attacked again. However, this time, they have more toys. They have more choices at their disposal. Manufacturing natural disaster scenarios, manufacturing epidemic scenarios, manufacturing terrorism events in the form of bomb events, nuclear events, biological events. They've planned ahead, and their preparation list includes all of these scenarios, all of them, every single one. At this point, I'm going to add in the threat of a cyber attack, which has equally dire consequences, and in fact could preempt any of the above scenarios. Please, I urge you, don't take my word for it, or any other person's word for these assumptions. This is not the time to panic, or to stick your head in the sand and pretend that this doesn't concern you. If you live in the U.S., if you have a family, if you breathe, if you eat, this concerns you. This is the time to think carefully and prepare wisely to the best of your abilities. I'm going to read you an excerpt, and for that I need this cool little piece of paper. And the author is Greg Palast. The book is Vulture's Picnic, and you can follow Greg on at Greg Palast. I don't know him, never spoken to him, but I was reading this, and it's a good premise for the stuff that I'd like to share with you today. The book concerns a memo that was delivered to Greg. And it confirms every conspiracy freak's fantasy that in the late 1990s, the top U.S. Treasury officials secretly conspired with a small cabal of banker big shots to rip apart financial regulations across the planet. Of course, when you see 26% unemployment in Spain, or more, I think, at this point, desperation and hunger in Greece, the riots in Indonesia, Detroit's bankrupt, you really need to go back to this endgame memo, which I'm going to discuss with you, which is the genesis of the blood and tears. Here, in this little story, the Treasury official playing the banker's secret endgame was Larry Summers. Summers was Barack Obama's leading choice for chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, the world's central bank, of course. Summers shouldn't be serving on the Fed. He should be serving hard time in a dungeon reserved for the criminally insane of the financial world. And the memo is authentic, by the way. And Greg had to fly to Geneva to get confirmation and wangle a meeting with the Secretary General of the World Trade Organization, Pasquale Lamy. Ironic name, that. Larry Summers' flunky, Timothy Geiger, is in this memo, reminding his boss to call the bank big shots to order their lobbyist armies to march. And I quote something from the memo. As we enter the end game of World Trade Organization financial services negotiations, I believe it would be a good idea for you to touch base with the CEOs. And here it is. To avoid Summers having to call his office to get the phone numbers, which under U.S. law would have to appear on public logs, Geiger listed the private lives of what were then the 5 most powerful CEOs on the planet. Goldman Sachs' John Corzine, Merrill Lynch's David Kamansky, Bank of America's David Coulter, Citibank's John Reed, and Chase Manhattan's Walter Shipley. It's not the little cabal of confabs held by Summers and the banksters that's so troubling. The horror is the purpose of the end game itself. So let me explain. The year was 1997. U.S. Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin was pushing hard to deregulate banks. That, of course, required first the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act to dismantle the barrier between commercial banks and investment banks. It was like replacing bank vaults with roulette wheels. Second, the banks wanted the right to play a new high-risk game called derivative trading. JP Morgan alone would soon carry $88 trillion of these pseudo-securities on its books as assets. Deputy Treasury Secretary Summers, soon to replace Rubin as secretary, body-blocked any attempt to control derivatives. But what was the use of turning U.S. banks into derivatives casinos if money would flee to nations with safer banking laws? The answer, conceived by the Big Bank Five, was to eliminate controls on banks in every nation on the planet in one single move. Now, it was brilliant as it was insanely dangerous, as we know. How could they pull off this mad caper? Well, the bankers in Summers' game was to use the Financial Services Agreement, or FSA, which is an obtruse and benign addendum to the international trade agreements policed by the World Trade Organization. Until the bankers began their play, these agreements dealt simply with trading goods, that is, my cars for your bananas. The new rules devised by Summers and the banks would force all nations to accept trade in bads or toxic assets like financial derivatives. Until the bankers redrafted the FSA, each nation controlled and chartered the banks within their own borders. The new rules of the game would force every nation to open their markets to Citibank, JP Morgan, and their derivatives products, all those toxic assets, as we know. And all 156 nations would have to smash down their own Glass-Steagall divisions between commercial savings banks and the investment banks that gamble with derivatives. The job of turning the FSA into the bankers' battering ram was given to Geiger, who was named ambassador. Why in the world would any nation agree to let its banking system be boarded and seized by financial pirates like JP Morgan? The answer in the case of Ecuador was bananas. They were a banana republic. Truly, the yellow fruit was that nation's life and death source of hard currency. If it refused to sign the new FSA, Ecuador could feed its bananas to the monkeys and go back to bankruptcy. So Ecuador signed, and so on, with every single nation bullied into signing. Every nation but one. Brazil's new president refused. In retaliation, Brazil was threatened with a virtual embargo of its products by the European Union's trade commissioner, one Peter Mandelson. But Lulu's refusenick stance paid off for Brazil, which, along with the Western nations, survived and thrived during the 2007 to 2009 banking crisis. China signed, but got its pound of flesh in return. It opened its banking sector a crack in return for access and control of the U.S. auto parts and other markets. Of course, very swiftly, 2 million U.S. jobs shifted to China. The new FSA pulled the lid off the Pandora's box of worldwide derivatives trade. Among the notorious transactions legalized, Goldman Sachs, where Treasury Secretary Rubin had been co-chairman, worked a secret euro derivative swap with Greece, which ultimately destroyed that nation. Ecuador, its own banking sector deregulated and demolished, exploded into riots. Argentina had to sell off its oil companies to the Spanish and water systems to Enron, while its teachers hunted for food in garbage cans. Then, bankers gone wild in the Eurozone dove headfirst into the derivatives pools without knowing how to swim. And the continent, of course, is now being sold off in tiny, cheap pieces to Germany, who currently has their own problems. Of course, it was not just threats that sold the FSA, but temptation as well. After all, every evil starts with one bite of an apple offered by a snake. The apple was the gleaming piles of lucre hidden in the FSA for local elites. The snake was named Larry. While billions of sorry souls are hurting from worldwide banker-made disasters, Rubin and Summers didn't do too badly. Rubin's deregulation of banks had permitted the creation of the financial monstrosity called Citigroups, and within weeks of leaving office, Rubin was named director and then chairman of Citigroup, which went bankrupt while managing to pay Rubin a total of $126 million. Rubin took another post as key campaign benefactor to a young state senator, Barack Obama. Only days after his election as president, Obama, at Rubin's insistence, gave Summers the odd post of U.S. economic czar and made Geithner his czarina, that is, of course, Secretary of the Treasury. In 2010, Summers gave up his royalist robes to return to consulting for Citibank and other creatures of bank deregulation, whose payments have raised Summers' net worth by $31 million and counting. Like I said, this is from a book called Vulture's Picnic by Greg Ballast, and I highly recommend that you read it because there are loads and loads of gems in that there book. So I want to talk now about the dollar collapse, which is coming. There is absolutely no doubt about it. The dollar collapse is going to be the single biggest event in human history. This is the first event in human history that will touch every living person on the planet, because all of our human activity has come to be controlled by money, our stability, our wealth, our food, security, our government. The dollar has been the de facto world currency, but this is changing, and all other currency collapses will pale in comparison to this one, because they've been more regional. However, this time it's global, and the dollar is dying despite QE infinity. The collapse of paper money is going to lead to collapse of all paper assets, and the repercussions will be felt globally thanks to the globalization of the controlled open trade. It is controlled. The globalization of banking institutions' insidious reach deep into other nations' banks and industry, and the global business model. Goldman Sachs is everywhere. The dollar controls the petro industry, which sets the trade standard for everything, including commodities, for the globe. The dollar controls the petro industry and every commodity. Do you get that? Everything you put in your mouth, everything that you put in your mouth that comes in a container is controlled by the petrodollar and that industry. The monies then cycle through the City of London and Wall Street. This fuels the corporate monster that acquires the world's wealth, harvesting it through mergers, acquisitions, buyouts, asset shedding, where things are dismantled and reassembled and the cycle begins anew. The corporate powers suppress real assets like natural resources and labor to provide themselves with astronomical profit, enormous profit. This fascist status collectivism model provides the money into the economy to fund an ever-increasing federal government. Federal governments grow larger and larger, enriching federal staff with jobs, perks, and retirement packages in order to control the citizenry. In 2010, federal employees in the U.S. averaged $126,141, while private sector employees averaged $62,757. In 2000, it was no different. Federal employees averaged $76,187, while the private sector employees averaged $45,772. Benito Mussolini stated that fascism should be more appropriately titled corporatism because it's a merger of state and corporate power. Where corporate influence overlaps government corruption, fascism spreads. America, therefore, has become a fascist state. You see, Monsanto, DuPont, Dow, Shell, BP, and all the multiple pharmaceutical companies now openly dictate to government voting and decisions via the influence of their lobbyists and those people that previously worked for these insidious companies that have been inserted into government seats of power via the revolving door, which has of late been turning with dizzying speed and voracity. The government controls other nations via its military-industrial complex. This cycle will be cut when the mathematically inevitable cycle of the collapse of the dollar begins. You see, in order for our debt-based money to function, we must increase our debt every single year in excess of the debt and the interest accrued the year before, or we enter a deflationary debt spiral. When debt is created, money is created. When debt is paid off, money is destroyed. There is never enough to pay off the debt because there would not be $1 in existence. We are at a point where we either default on the debt or we create more money in debt to keep the cycle going. The problem is that if you understand anything about compounding interest, we're reaching a moment where the more debt that is incurred, the less effective it is. And this leads us by the nose into hyperinflation. There are only two entities needed for this, and that would be the lender of last resort, who's the Federal Reserve, and the spender of last resort, which is the federal government. This, of course, is the perfect time to remind you that the Federal Reserve is not a federal agency. It's not related to the federal government at all. So the lender and spender of last resort can and will blow up the entire system. Money and emergency measures are worn out. QE infinity cannot carry this indefinitely. It's barely carrying it right now. The fact that none of the underlying problems that caused the 2008 collapse has been resolved begs this. The only difference now is that instead of corporate problems, we have national problems. And in the bigger picture, we have global problems. The savings and investments for the world flow through Wall Street. As America and the world wakes up, or is rudely woken up, by the collapse of the dollar and the destruction of the dollar as the petro-currency because of other countries' desire to diversify away from the one controlling oil commodities currency, the petrodollar, and the massive fraud that has been perpetrated on all people, and in particular on Americans, the loss of wealth is going to be immense and catastrophic in America, in particular. This is going to have a profound effect on our regional economies. No one is prepared for self-sufficiency past a few days, and most everyone is fully vested in a dollar currency paradigm. Everyone is hooked up to the energy grid of electricity, our local grocery stores, our restaurants, our cell phones, and the internet. We just had riots as people were standing, waiting to buy their latest iPhone. What is it, iPhone 5 now? It's insanity. It's just insanity. I was listening to this earlier this morning. These people are insane. Extreme forms of credit excess across the world have reached or surpassed levels seen shortly before the Lehman crisis 5 years ago. The Bank of International Settlements has warned the extraordinary measures by central banks, this unrestrained printing, has awakened in the markets the illusion that the massive liquidity pumped into the market could solve the fundamental problems facing people and their governments. All problems are increasing exponentially relative to this massive printing exercise. They go on to say, the hunt for yields to overcome previous shortfalls is luring investors in mass into high-risk investments at a rate reminiscent of the more positive exuberance prior to the global crisis of 2007 and 2008. This is happening just as the U.S. Federal Reserve was thought to be winding down their stimulus and start to drain the dollar liquidity from the global markets, an inflection point fraught with danger, which could go horribly wrong. And as I'm going to show you later, our government is planning for this moment. Are you? William White, the BIS former chief economist, famous for flagging the wild behavior in the debt markets before the global storm that hit in 2008, said that today's behavior looks like 2008 all over again, only this time on steroids. Germany, of course, is facing its own banking crisis as the German government bails out state-owned banks with taxpayer money after their management gambled away billions on subprime investments. All of this means that as everyone gambles to recover losses in a hyperinflated marketplace, and more means less and less, when the inevitable taper occurs, as it must at some point, the markets will implode, taking far more with them than analysts are addressing. No one's talking. Frankly, neither the US nor the global market can sustain quantitative easing unlimited. It's not possible. It's a mathematical, nonsensical, idiot speak issue. We also understand, of course, that the people doing this quantitative easing have never actually known ordinary people, nor have they really worked or lived on Main Street. They don't care, do they, that printing this money positively affects perhaps 3% of the population, if that? Yes, of course, right now silver is up over 6%, gold is up over 4%, copper is up, I think it's at 2.4%, crude oil is up 2.68% and counting, due to this issue in Syria. I mean, that's nice. Theoretically, all these things are going up. The vast majority of people, however, real people, living, breathing people, not corporate people, they need gas to go to work. They need gas to cook. They need gas to heat their homes. Trucking lines need gas to move product. Our chains of supply are very, very long across the United States. This translates to increased expenses for people across the board. So you see, asset prices are up. All those paper asset, ethereal things are up. But the cost of living is soaring. Only 11% of Americans directly own shares right now, down from 17% 5 years ago. This means that over the last 5 years, 6% of those Americans owning stocks liquidated them. This points to a severe contraction in even the accessibility of stock market investing for real people. So, there are some things, additional things, that we need to know. I want to read you something. Robert Welch, in 1958, he was the founder of the John Birch Society. In 1974, he said the following. 1. This is how you, as an aside, this is the future plan for America. 1. You induce gradual surrender of the American society to international business and organizations. The UN, of course, is a big example. You greatly expand government spending for the purpose of getting rid of ever more of the US dollars as wastefully as possible. Then you go with higher and much higher and even higher taxes. Then you take an increasingly unbalanced budget despite the higher taxes. Then you introduce wild inflation of the currency. Government control of prices, wages, and materials, supposedly to combat inflation. All right. Anyone seeing a theme here? Additionally, you greatly expand socialist controls over every aspect of economy and every activity of people's daily lives. This is to be accompanied by a correspondingly huge increase in the size of bureaucracy and the size and reach of the domestic government. Far more centralization of power in Washington and the practical elimination of our state lines and alliances. There is a many-faceted drive to have our state lines be no more within this nation. The advance of aid and control over the public education system leading to complete government control of education. See how this theme is continuing? A constant hammering into the consciousness of the American psyche of the horrors of modern warfare. The absolute necessity of absolute peace. Peace at all cost. So, we go to war to effect peace. Yes. The consequent willingness of the American people to allow the steps of appeasement by government, which amount to a piecemeal surrender of the rest of the free world by the U.S. itself. All right. Of course, the Federal Reserve surprised the markets and everyone else, but by deciding to, hold off on the weaning of a single dollar of that $85 billion dollar quantitative easing or stimulus that supposedly is flooding our economy, this artificial crutch to hold in place the American bond buying habit. This isn't about feeding anyone of the 46 million Americans on food stamps. This isn't about dredging the water out of the millions of homes underwater, drowning in debt that exceeds the value of their homes. This isn't about housing veterans or keeping academic tuition affordable or even about unfettered access to state parks. And it sure as hell isn't about you, the American people, or me, and our children's future, or our security, or our protection of our retirement benefits, or any other single thing that touches the lives of everyday people every single day. Even Bernanke was gracious enough to concede that the U.S. economy may be faltering, although truth be told, it never recovered, even momentarily. The numbers were just fudged. I mean, these statistics that they were pulling out are just manipulated hogwash. He went on, of course, to urge patience and described America's stalled economy as facing headwinds, while wistfully murmuring absent-mindedly needing more evidence of a sustained economic recovery before withdrawing any fiscal stimulus or quantitative easing. There are a few ways that this can play out in the near and more long term, and none of them bode well for you or I and the millions of others. In fact, there's something dreadfully terrifying about each of the likely scenarios because there are fundamental things to know. And the vast majority don't know. They don't understand the fundamentals. You see, we've been told so often, in so many ways, at so many points along the path in our lives, to leave it to the experts. And we've abdicated so much responsibility, so much personal responsibility in the spirit of progress. all in the spirit of economic and intellectual progress, whereby our lives are inundated with experts on everything. There isn't a facet of our lives where there isn't an expert on call, on the radio, who's just put out a book, who's just being interviewed, who's telling you what to do, what to think, how to feel, what to put in your mouth, what not to put in your mouth, where to put your money, how to educate your kids. We have trusted this system. Why not? But here's what's happened. We have become crippled by what we perceive as our own lack of experience in the face of all of this exceptional expertise in countless disciplines. This is progress, is it not? And in the progress of this hustle and bustle towards progress and abundance, an inevitable perspective of abundance, as we've progressed to infinity, we have forgotten everything. So this is my personal crash course in the fundamental concepts of government economics and your slice of the perceived pie of abundance, so that you can understand not only how poverty-stricken you are, but so that you can understand in some measure how you've been sold an abundance paradigm under the guise of progress, which is indeed merely abundant poverty, whereby the only thing of value which counts in the banking coffers is the attachment of your beating heart to your social security number, which in turn collects a tax, otherwise known as personal income tax, and it's around 25%, which is based solely upon your sweat equity, the fruits of your labor as defined by the government on behalf of Banking Incorporated. You see, inflation is one of the greatest stealth taxes in the history of banking. Diabolical, isn't it? It's absolutely, completely out there, and people don't understand this. So, I want to read you this quote. I love this quote. Apathy is the path to slavery. Slavery is the body of bondage, and bondage is the path to revolution. Additionally, a prisoner's chains are always heavier than a soldier's pack. So, that brings me to a couple little doohickeys here, which I have to find. Someone abandoned 2 kittens at my house the other day, which has really thrown a spanner in the works for me, because, of course, this is an aside to this whole banking thing. While I have been trying to balance radio shows and homeschooling kids and clients and everything else, my mother-in-law actually had an enormous tumor in her brain removed, which they had thought was a tumor, and it turned out that it was a blood clot. And there have been all sorts of ramifications and additional issues attached to that. So, and then yesterday I had no power at my house, which was interesting. So at this point, I want to thank Jules, our program manager, for just, staying on standby while she was waiting for what was supposed to be a pre-recorded program to run today, which didn't happen yesterday because I didn't have power. And I was backwards and forwards to the hospital and the vet with kittens and mothers-in-law and all kinds of crazy stuff. And so I have 2 kittens on my lap and a dog at my feet who's sitting on some of my notes, and he's not being very cooperative. So I'm having to kind of push him around over here. All right, I'm just going to kind of muddle through this, which is not to say that we can muddle through our economic situation like we did in 2008. Between then and now, the effect has cascaded across the globe, and it's infiltrated every nook and cranny of commerce, banking, and livelihoods. The Ponzi scheme is in shambles, guys. The monolithic currency dominance and the controlled markets are crumbling while still yielding more enormous, fantastical profits and benefits for the top 3%, 2%, and 1%. What is going to happen when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? We are going to find out. When infinite money meets the finite world, the shit's going to hit the fan. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on this radio. Anyway, let me explain something to you. The Treasury creates a bond, which is a debt. They sell it to the Federal Reserve, which is not part of the federal government, as I said. They in turn credit the Treasury with Federal Reserve notes, and presto, you have this thing we call money. The Treasury must pay back that bond debt plus the interest. Since only the debt money exists, more debt money must be created to pay the old debt plus the interest. So, capiche? Get that? Big trouble's coming our way. Let's talk about a few things that I've been talking about with some of the other alternative media writers and public speakers. Charlie McGrath has put out a few things over the last couple of weeks on Wide Awake News, and we've just done the United We Strike monthly marathon, where we ask everyone the second Saturday of every month to don't shop, don't comply, and ask why. Well, I'm going to run through some things concerning FEMA, and then you tell me what you think. We all know, of course, that FEMA is hoarding 420 million meals ready to eat. They're stockpiling 7 bullets for every man, woman, and child in the USA. They've opened enough FEMA camps to house 50 million people. Did I mention that these bullets can only be used domestically? They can't be used internationally. FEMA's also taken possession of and paid for, by the way, 17,000 guillotines. They've outfitted their FEMA trains with shackles, and they've spread all of these purchases throughout the multiplicity of federal offices, including the staff allocation columns for Social Security officers, where no one's even carrying a gun on behalf of Uncle Sam. And then, and this is classic, FEMA refused to answer any questions or even respond to congressional requests for explanations. And then, of course, we have drones in our domestic skies. Never mind all the drones overseas. We've got additional AK-762s, 600,000 of them that have been purchased, magazine rifles for them, 2 million rounds of ammo for those particular weapons to Camp Stanley, 500,000 blanks to Camp Stanley for that particular weapon. We have an astronomical amount of toys delivered to Bluegrass Army Depot. And then there's this, which is in direct violation of the proposed UN gun treaty, which I found comical, despite the severity of the situation. We have UN gun treaty. They want to mandate the flow of international weapons because they want to, make sure that innocent people aren't getting killed. Obama has said he's going to sign this in October. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, said, absolutely, I endorse this, and we're going to sign it. That we was not the royal we, her, and Bill Clinton. That was her royal Secretary of State we-ness, as in on behalf of the American people. There's this little paragraph that I found in FEMA, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, the purpose of foreign weapons programs to procure a selection of fully functional foreign-made weapons to support classroom training so students can easily identify and render safe for transport weapon systems found on foreign battlefields. Vendor systems shall include all parts in factory new condition with their mechanisms inherent to the complete system. So our veterans can't have guns. Dianne Feinstein sure as heck doesn't want me to have a gun. You all definitely shouldn't have guns, according to our politicians, because the UN wants to eliminate all of these guns from the hands of terrorists. But our various federal agencies, including the Social Security Office, has guns, weapons, armored trucks, militarization of Social Security Office. I mean, are you kidding me? I recently read a book called The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Radley Balko. What a nice guy. But what he wrote about is not so nice. It's all about cops increasingly like soldiers. They're being, of course, increasingly militarized, dressed like soldiers, armed like soldiers. They're being sent out into urban environments and told that they are fighting a war. And when you do this to our policemen in residential urban areas, fighting a war, we tell them, course, the results are inevitable as we see escalating police violence, police brutality towards the civilian population, whereby our police are treating civilians more like enemy combatants than citizens with rights. The SWAT team raids. Did you know that over the last 20 years, there's been a 1,500% increase in the number of SWAT team raids in the United States? Our SWAT teams now look like military teams invading a terrorist-occupied village in a far-off land. The Department of Homeland Security should be applauded, and I say this with all irony, because they have indeed brought the war on terror to the streets of America. So let's go on with this whole thing about FEMA. We have our UN peacekeepers learning urban warfare and English and U.S. weapon systems, and they have a deadline to learn all this stuff by. That deadline is October 1st, 2013. We now know that there's 386,000 foreign troops on U.S. soil. There's going to be no leave for U.S. military from September 28th to November 5th. There's a blackout on these dates for all the military. NORCON training is happening. This is the civil unrest drills. This is happening in the northeast coastal areas. In addition, on the Department of Homeland Security website, it says agents must qualify with sidearms, shotgun, AR-15, and a host of other things, all by September 28th, 2013. So, in years gone by, you could go to these websites and you could see when rehearsals were taking place. And it's an ongoing kind of training program. And, oh, shucks, if something happens and you guys can't do this drill, well, you can do the next drill slated for 3 months' time, 6 months' time, 7, 9 months' time, perhaps even a year from now. What's interesting to note, and it's imperative that you understand this, all of these training drills, all of these expectations and qualifications are ordered, not expected, they are ordered to be completed in various time allocations, starting with September 22nd, 25th, 28th, October 3rd, October 5th, and there are no projected catch-up dates past this point. This I've never seen before. I've never seen this before. So when you have these two things that I'm going to tell you about, testing of the GPS and satellite communication, this testing is being coordinated for the very first time ever with a testing date of September 29th. The very first time ever. You have the North American grid shutdown drill scheduled for November. You have President of the United States mandates to FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security concerning support for metropolitan communities dealing with quasi-extreme climate change must be completed by October 1st. And all of these mandates were signed in the last 5 weeks. Mandate after mandate after mandate, drill after drill after drill, with end dates all before November 1st. And then we have the North American grid shutdown drill coming up after that. Something else. More than 300 school systems in the United States have been allocated 3-day survival kits, one for each child in the school, across 300 school districts. All deliveries are scheduled for September 2003. All our National Guard units are to complete their riot control and disaster assistance training during this year's annual 2-week training, and all units must have all their training complete by September 30th. Hello, there is no catch-up dates for any of this stuff. No projected catch-up dates. I know I keep saying this, but it's important that you understand that this is the first time I've ever seen this. And myself, like many, many others who have been writing about this, have been really watching these sites and looking at these sites for years. Some of us have been, doing this for a really long time. In addition, we have daily testing of emergency broadcast systems to begin on September 25th and run through October 2nd. So you're going to have daily testing from the 25th of September to October the 2nd. You've got the Eastern Coast Guard units are going to perform massive group training, which is usually reserved for Gulf Coast areas, except this time They're going to be doing this in Virginia and the Delaware areas. And these are 10-day training missions to commence September 26th. I want to point out that Virginia and Delaware is in FEMA's District 3, which is been seeing a lot of its own activity just lately. And the FEMA camp over in District 5 has lights on, it's fully staffed, and they've been having their own drills on accepting people and moving people out. And then we've had, over the last 2 years, of course, all of these Black Hawks, military hawks, being used in training exercises without any notification to either the mayor's office or even local police departments. Recently, Obama requested 15,000 additional Russian military personnel for an upcoming disaster. Now, if you know that there are currently 386,000 Polish and Russian troops on U.S. soil, and now we have 15,000 additional Russian troops, you see there's a point of diminishing return here. And when the visual, fiscal, and economic collapse comes, it's going to be rapid. It's going to be all-encompassing. It's going to engulf everything, and everyone's going to be scooped up in this dragnet. You see, this whole thing with FEMA signing this bilateral law, which loosens posse comitatus and allows foreign troops on U.S. soil. A lot of people say to me, well, you know, FEMA's our disaster preparedness. It's there to help people in the event of a disaster. No, it's not. FEMA is not there for the people. FEMA is merely for invoking the continuity of government, the acronym of which is COG. Don't you find that ironic? Because I surely do. So we have all these Russian and Polish troops on U.S. soil. And we have all this stuff going on in Syria, and we've got Russia brokering a deal with Syria to, you know, avert nuclear holocaust, World War III, end games. I mean, you know, pick your poison. But I think, you know, war with Russia is possible, of course, but it's going to be somewhat contrived and not at all spontaneous, and rather awkward for all the posturing in and around Syria and everything else that's been going on, which, of course, this whole thing that's going on there is not really about Syria, and I hope you guys get that. It's America as both the petulant, spoiled, fat kid who's having its candy taken away in the international market, which is, you know, the exclusive petrodollar. And it's also the playground bully, because it's seeking to find its way directly to the source of the injustice, perceived or otherwise, namely Iran and the Iranian bourse, which is seeking to trade oil and oil derivatives in a separate agreed-upon basket of currencies with other superpowers, and, of course, anyone willing to play ball. So this brings you to the rush by the U.S. president, our POTUS, to sign up as many countries as humanly possible or inhumanly possible to the Trans-Pacific Pact as fast as possible. Obama stated that he's going to sign this in October with zero scrutiny or zero transparency from anyone, anywhere, even Congress, most especially from Congress. Did you know that Congress has complained that they've not seen a single document pertaining to the Trans-Pacific Pact and have been stonewalled at every turn? The Trans-Pacific Pact is the most blatant precursor to a one-world government. And no one's really talking about this either. Of course, you know, when I say no one, I mean all the people owned by Comcast, Disney, Viacom, CBS, News Corp, Time Warner, you know, those guys. The mainstream media, the lamestream media, the ones that Dianne Feinstein says are those qualified to report the news, which is not really reporting the news. It's taking the memos from the White House desk and regurgitating it with a teleprompter. It's not people like us that are putting this out there for you to disseminate. None of us get paid. You know, I really want to point this out. None of us, I mean, maybe Alex Jones makes a buck or two off of it, and there's a few others. But for the most part, all the people whose sites you go to and stuff you read and all of these radio network corporations and organizations and their affiliates don't make any money. I don't get paid to be here and tell you all about this. Neither does any of the other people that I know. Not Matt, not Karen, certainly not Charlie, they all do this because we feel so strongly. So that was my little rant-a-roni. I want you to Google the Rex 84 and, of course, the FEMA-sponsored North American blackout drill, or as some are calling it, the constitutional kill switch, which is scheduled for November 13th and 14th. You must view this drill with extreme prejudice. And here I'm going to refer to the Executive Order 13603, which allows federal agencies on behalf of POTUS to take control of every resource, invoking involuntary conscription, every drop of water, every grain of rice, and even your vehicle or the gas that it holds. I dare you to go and read this executive order, please. So while the GPS and satellite communications drill and the North American grid shutdown drill could be a beta test, you must be aware that many in the energy industry are on record saying that in the event of a shutdown, either an accidental or a catastrophic purposeful shutdown, there is huge, enormous concern in the industry that it may prove to be impossible to get it all back, to switch on the lights, at least not right away. So I think I'm kind of running out of time. So I want to remind you that you can send me commentaries, comments, questions, and your thoughts directly to me at the Canary Chronicles at outlook.com. Canary Chronicles at outlook.com. And I really hope that this hour has inspired some of you to go and do some more research, and I hope that it's certainly insulted some others, and I hope that I've provoked you into doing some of your own research. Next week, what I'm going to do is focus more exclusively on more of the survival things and the things that you need to be doing and preparing for in the event of martial law, because our economy is being destroyed from the top on down. You need to start stocking up. You need to start teaming up. You need to cycle your dollars locally and not through Walmart. If the northeastern grid line goes down, you're going to have the highest fatalities because it's the coldest climate and it's got the most people, and we're heading into winter. QE infinity, this whole quantitative easing infinitum, is merely stalling the inevitable. The collapse should have happened, but it is going to happen. It's not an if, it is. Are you prepared? The only way that this is going to stall itself any further is if the U.S. goes to war and invokes the military-industrial complex, whereby the art and the act of going to war is the impetus to create more fiat currency to pay for war. So it's going to come in October, it's going to come in November, it's going to come in January, it's going to come in 6 months from now. It doesn't matter. This catastrophic collapse is going to happen. The dollar is going to collapse. We are not going to be the reserve currency of the world, and the Trans-Pacific Pact cannot single-handedly prop up the dollar. So the million-dollar question is, will there be a socioeconomic collapse? Yes, I really do believe that. Will the fabric of society break down? Look, if we're scrambling and climbing all over each other to buy an iPad and an iPhone, are you kidding me? If the government is anything to go by, if people are anything to go by, yes, there's going to be a breakdown in social infrastructure. Yes, there's going to be a breakdown in economic infrastructure. Yes, there are going to be massive changes, and none of them are going to bode well for the people. Remember that 90% of the U.S. population is urban, not rural. 7 million people died during the Great Depression, and there was a vast rural population that was used to being self-sufficient. We are a population that hasn't the foggiest idea of how to take care of ourselves. We are dependent upon incredibly long chains of supply for even the most basic of things, and our electricity. The U.S. has an enormous amount of nuclear energy. This nuclear energy is dependent upon our electrical grid. Even if the nuclear plants are shut down, they still rely on the energy grid to take care of those irksome little rods, you know, like the ones they're having issues with over there in Japan, Fukushima. The other thing is those people that are on prescription meds, diabetics that are insulin dependent, What are they going to do? How about that food stamp population of 46 million and climbing? Do you know that 100 million Americans are in some way on U.S. government subsidies, housing, food, medicine? What do you think is going to happen when an energy grid goes down, when military trucks start patrolling the streets of the United States, when people on food stamps can't cash their food stamps for food because there is no food? It's a completely unnatural lifestyle that we lead. We're so far removed from the natural order of the cycles of the weather, our food, and our capacity. We need to be talking about this. So, coming into the following shows, I'm going to be talking about aquaponic systems, growing food, looking at alternative medicine supplies, growing medicines, growing foods, how to deal with your kids in school. Understand that there's a very easy way that they can get you into a FEMA camp, and that is they're going to bus your kids there straight from school. So, and sorry, this has all been a very doom and gloom exercise. It's not. It's a challenge. Feet forward, eyes forward. Again, you can contact me at canarychronicles@outlook.com with any feedback, and you can catch me tomorrow, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, California time, on Wide Awake News. I'll be teasing out some of the details of strategic urban warfare with my fantastic guest from London, and walking you through the numbers. Thank you.